There are countless jokes about dead churches, dead Christians, and dead faith. After all, faith without works is dead, if you remember what the Bible says. I'm also positive that the phrase living dead has been applied to less than vibrant faith communities in sermons, books, blogs, and even podcasts. Beyond these snarky comments meant to create a titter in the pews, there are more intense comments about the undead that escape the lips of believers. Listen to this clip from Pat Robertson, former host of the Christian program, The 700 Club.
President Aristide declared our religion is voodoo. And voodoo is a satanic type of culture. I mean, it just destroys them.
Robertson also once claimed that an old pact with the devil to remove the French is also at work in creating socioeconomic and natural disaster ills on the island of Haiti.
Something happened a long time ago in Haiti, and people may not want to talk about it. They were under the heel of the French, and they got together and swore a pact to the devil. They said, we will serve you if you'll get us free from the French. It's a true story. And so the devil said, okay, it's a deal. And they kicked the French out. You know, the Haitians revolted and got themselves free. But ever since, they have been cursed by one thing after the other, desperately poor.
While not taking the same faith-based stance that Robertson did, writers for the New York Times, such as David Brooks, and writers for the Wall Street Journal, such as Lawrence Harrison, both released pieces lambasting voodoo, or vodun, as a belief system that is resistant to progress. The imagery of voodoo and adjacent religions such as vodou and hoodoo permeates Christian critiques of indigenous religions and explanations of various disasters. It also functions as a pejorative for many in the West to refer to unexplained phenomena or to make light of alternative approaches to life. Voodoo has been featured in pop culture franchises such as American Horror Story Coven, where Marie Laveau, an historic and renowned practitioner of voodoo in New Orleans, was a character played by Angela Bassett. At one point in the series, Marie raises one of the most recognizable monsters in the world to attack a rival group of witches, the zombie.
You know exactly who I am and what I'm capable of. Just like I know exactly what you are, witch. I can smell the stink of it on you.
I mean, after all, your kind and my kind have been going after each other for centuries.
Christianity, voodoo, zombies, and New Orleans all came together for me personally on a rainy day in New Orleans when I was presenting at the National Communication Association annual conference. Having never been there before, I decided to spend a day walking around the various historic locations and taking in tours and museums related to art, culture, true crime, and of course, the undead, as one does. New Orleans is famously associated with vampires, thanks to Anne Rice's fictional Vampire Chronicles, as well as the real-life community of sanguinarian vampires who call the city home. There is even a vampire shop, Boutique des Vampires, in the French Quarter, but it was the Voodoo Museum that really caught my attention. Upon entering the space, I was greeted by numerous portraits of important practitioners and figures associated with the religion. As I moved from room to room, familiar, iconic artifacts associated with voodoo could be seen, such as voodoo dolls, candles, skulls, and other various figurines. What was surprising, and what I had been kind of hoping to see, was the many Christian icons and materials in the museum. Crosses, Bibles, the King James Version no less, and stories of the intermingling of the Catholic faith as well as general Christian faith were placed throughout the museum. They told stories of colonization, oppression, slavery, and syncretism as peoples from West Africa, Haiti, and Saint-Domingue and other locations blended their indigenous beliefs with the Christianities, most notably Roman Catholicism, of those in power in America. While Christian personalities love to discuss voodoo as being solely related to others outside of their faith, there are links historically between the church and the development of voodoo in America. The monstrous other for so many Christians like Pat Robertson is partially a product of monstrous behavior by those professing the faith of Jesus. Which brings us back to zombies, those rotting, undead, ambling figures that eat people's brains, usually in extreme gory detail. But a closer look at the zombie from the perspective of voodoo and Christianity and literature reveals that they aren't just figures of horror, but like so many monsters, they are entities that embody a biting critique of society that we need to pay attention to. To explore this intersection of Christianity, voodoo, the undead, and zombies, I invited someone who not only built her career around monsters, but whose specialty is the undead and zombies. I am thrilled to be able to have Dr. Emily Zarka, host of PBS Digital Studios Monstrum and an instructor of English at Arizona State University, back on our program. I'm calling this episode The Faith of Zombies. I'm Seth Pierce, and welcome to Beast and Bible. Emily, thank you so much for coming back on Beast and Bible. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm super excited for our conversation.
Yeah, there's so much to cover. I want to start with sort of your area of specialty, Gothic literature from 1805 to 1863. That was the area of your dissertation. And to some degree, all of everybody's dissertations are super niche, but this is one that really stuck out to me because you really look at the undead, basically, in this period. So of all the subjects to decide to explore, what made the undead come to life for you? And what can you tell us about the undead in these works that predate a lot of our modern popular zombie works that we'll talk about?
Of course. So first thing is that I've always been a big fan of horror. Some of my earliest memories are watching terrible sci-fi and horror movies with my mom, including Night of the Living Dead.
Because of the obvious threat to untold numbers of citizens, and because of the crisis which is even now developing, this radio station will remain on the air day and night. These are the facts as we know them. There is an epidemic of mass murder being committed by a virtual army of unidentified assassins. The murders are taking place in villages, cities, rural homes, and suburbs with no apparent pattern or reason for the slayings. Eyewitnesses say they are ordinary-looking people. Some say they appear to be in a kind of trance.
There was always, even from a young age, this sort of gut feeling that I had that there was something not just intriguing about reanimated corpses, but they seemed to me to act as like cultural touchstones or had more meaning than other types of monsters. So that was kind of percolating in my brain for a long time. And then as I started exploring romantic literature and discovering Gothic literature, I was like, oh, this is sort of when the forms that we would maybe recognize today in popular culture are really taking place. So the undead came alive or re-alive for me in my undergraduate work, an honors thesis that would then become some of the inspiration for my dissertation. And that dissertation and a larger interest in monsters would become me being a monster expert, which is an incredible title I get to claim. So I've just been incredibly fortunate. But in terms of what I think it's important to keep in mind about older iterations of the undead, even the time period that I look at, late 18th and early 19th century, those aren't even our earliest stories of the undead, but what I believe to be a crucial period and when they sort of entered undead fiction. To the best of my knowledge, every single spiritual practice out there or community out there that buries their dead has some kind of undead monster in their folklore and in their even religions in some cases. And I think that's really interesting, but not surprising given all the questions we have about life after death. Is that bodily? Is that spiritually? Is that different parts of a soul? How does that actually look? And then, of course, again, this is something I discovered with the Gothic genre that I think still holds true today and actually holds true for the zombie genre in particular, is that revolution and revolutionary ideas at the turn of the 19th century promoted a lot of this sort of monstrous behavior that then was explored in the pages of the Gothic. So themes of like passion and terror and excess, precarity of political systems and monarchy systems and patriarchal systems took on grotesque form in bodies, and particularly undead bodies, served as a corporeal figurehead, literally, for confronting those tensions head on. So I've always seen the undead as being about revolution and resistance as much as they are about maybe sucking your blood or chasing after you in the dark.
Yeah, very well put. And it reminds me, just looking at some of the history of the Gothic, one of the interesting things, you mentioned revolution, so much of the Gothic aesthetic, as I understand it, when you look at some of the fights between Protestants and Catholics in England, where depending on who's in power, the Protestants lopping the heads off of saint statues, desecrating cathedrals. One of my favorite places to go when I get to Wales is Tintern Abbey, this beautiful Gothic ruin cathedral. And that really becomes embedded in the landscape in England and all these sort of ruins, and it leads to different sort of meditations on death and decay. And then on another level, you've got, and please correct me if any of this is wrong, but when people are finding out about the circulatory system, right? Like how blood works, how our bodies work, you start getting into vampire lore, Dracula, Frankenstein, this relationship that we have as human beings who, for many people who are very religious human beings, but also we have these scientific discoveries and we're trying to process all of this. And so really a lot of Gothic literature is not just reflecting on these ruins and aesthetics and trying to find national identity and heritage, linking ourselves back with the Goths, but also speculating on science and superhuman or unhuman realities. Am I kind of on the right track?
Oh, no, you're definitely dead on there. I think that science and religion have gone hand in hand forever. And we do see that maybe take more obvious or recognizable form as people who live in the 21st century during that period, right? Where, a lot of things like electricity and steam engines and like automation, like all those things were starting to happen. And I think that was and still is today, right? Very scary thoughts. And again, that's why I think that the Gothic and horror in particular have been all about, to me, exploration and resistance. Because I think the other thing to keep in mind with these conversations is that a lot of these undead beings, particularly in the Gothic literature, are coming from marginalized voices. Women played a huge role in the creation of the Gothic genre, particularly in Britain. And I think that sort of informs my work as well, is how can horror and how can the undead and how can monsters in general sort of let us recognize other histories and other understandings of those sciences. Frankenstein obviously being the perfect sort of example of, you have Mary Shelley dealing with the death of her own children, the death of her mother giving birth to her, the complicated relationship she had with her father and with education. She stated in the second edition that she was directly influenced by Galvanism. But I think there's also some mummy illusions and like autopsy stuff going on there, in addition to all the other sciences that she's talking about. And that's before you even get into sort of the larger ideas. She's asking about identity and childhood. So I think that what science fiction, Gothic literature, and horror maybe have in common is that because they've traditionally been seen as sort of marginal genres or lesser than, like we are just starting to recognize in the last 50 years, some of these texts as being classical or canonical, which I could rant about for forever, right? But I think that recognizing how they've served as these spaces for speculation, and in some cases have even predicted technologies and futures that we're seeing today. And the same can be said for zombie movies and zombie comics. And I think that's maybe what holds my interest in the undead, is that they continue to evolve as these cultural bodies, as we as humanity also evolve.
It's been interesting on the podcast, which of course looks at kind of the intersection of religion and monsters and pop culture. One thing that's been really interesting to watch, and I don't know, because your background is literature, right? Is that more English? Is that correct? Yeah. And so, and I don't know if that's been the case in that field. I know in religious studies and even in communication studies, pop culture was sort of not so much, but in the last 15 years, it's really sort of gotten a foothold where people are really taking it seriously, whether it's the monstrous we find in sacred texts like the Bible, or whether it's horror or Gothic critiques on culture. People are really, okay, now we're making spaces to really look at these texts as informing our culture, critiquing our culture and identity. One of my favorite books is called The Victorian Ghost Story in Theology. And these narratives as theological texts, kind of critiquing scientific developments and almost haunting the reader with possibilities of the afterlife. And it completely changes the story when you kind of realize what's going on in the background.
I love that. That sounds right up my alley. That's the other facet that really defines the Gothic genre, is its play with religion. Sometimes that's positive representation. A lot of times it's not. But I think, again, that speaks to some of the events that were going on when the Gothic genre really took hold. So it doesn't seem surprising at all to me that you can read, these theological journeys and ghost stories, because even the concept of a ghost in at least Christian thought does speak to some kind of afterlife that is maybe not necessarily tangible, but visible to the living, which I think is really interesting then to consider the undead body. And again, that's one of the corporeality of the undead body I find super interesting, because there's ways, of course, you can get rid of undead bodies, supposedly, but those are usually more challenging or more difficult than ghosts. And I think that there's also something really scary that it's not like we're just going to be this pretty incorporeal ghost form that gets to float around and watch our loved ones or haunt them or what have you, but that we're going to have a rotting corpse knocking on our door, asking to have that final conversation. And I think the visceralness of that and the confrontation of the body itself is something that, and again, I'm speaking a little bit I was raised Catholic, so I'm thinking more towards that tradition. I think there's something, this idea of resurrection as well as being beautiful, but also being terrifying. And I think that the undead really, again, sort of live on both worlds. They sort of have one foot in each side.
Yeah. So looking at this transition now, so looking at this interplay, especially with like the ghosts, more of the incorporeal, I'm thinking of like 19th century spiritualism shows up, the telegraph shows up on the scene, spiritualists kind of latch on to the telegraph and use that as scientific proof. And you get in some really, and we've talked about this in other episodes in the podcast, some really weird discussions between Christians who are horrified at sort of what is in their view necromancy, and then others saying, no, this is proof that what we believe is true. But how do we go from whether it's Gothic literature, whether it's just literature in the 19th century, how do we move from sort of this incorporeal ghost figures to like the zombie, right? Like this shuffling, rotting corpse, brain eating. Where do we start seeing maybe that pivot, or do we find that in older literature as well? Like, talk a little bit about that transition.
Yeah, great question. So it's kind of a two-pronged question. So the first part of the answer, which I'll explain in more detail in a second, is that the concept of the zombie, the ZOMBI, existed for a couple hundred years before already. So that was floating around, but just not necessarily in Western white thought. So the 20th century definitely brought more of those conversations to a global scale. And part of what also went hand in hand with the development of the flesh-eating zombie definitely comes alongside films. There's a film history to everything as well. But going back, and this is one of, I think, the most important things about the zombie, and one of the reasons I was so passionate to do the Exhumed documentary with PBS is we wouldn't have the zombie without slavery. And I think that for fans of like modern zombie films, that's sometimes hard for people to sort of wrap their brains around. But the zombie came from the religious practice of Voodoo. So Voodoo is a religion that first came to be in what is now Haiti in the 17th century, when enslaved Africans originating from different geographic, cultural, and spiritual backgrounds were forced to come together, especially from like Western Africa tradition. And as sort of a necessity, you have all these people who don't have common backgrounds, but they did have a few things in common: ancestor worship, belief in these different spirits, things like drum work being really important. They were forced to, but also as a form of, I think, resistance and perseverance, come together with this new religion. So they took those African spiritual practices, combined them with elements of Catholicism, native Haitian traditions, to create Voodoo. And Voodoo further evolved in the United States before and after the Haitian Revolution, when primarily French slave owners brought their enslaved peoples to the United States. And then in turn, those people came in contact with American-born slaves, North American indigenous beliefs, and European folk traditions, and gave us capital V Voodoo. And there's no one sort of standard dogma of Voodoo. And I should say that Voodoo and Voodoo, some people use interchangeably, although I think a lot of the priests and priestesses in those faiths would maybe not disagree with sort of that conflation. And I made the caveat of saying capital V Voodoo because that is a real religion. And I want to point that out because there's lowercase v Voodoo, which I would consider to be the sort of horror movie version of Voodoo, right? It's like the fake stuff that's sensationalized, that's usually painted as black magic or witchcraft, and that we see in a lot of pop culture texts. That is not the religion that it's sort of appropriating from. And I do think that lowercase Voodoo is appropriating from Voodoo and Voodoo for personal, usually economic gain. But in terms of the ZOMBI, as this practice of Voodoo was coming to be, of course, the practitioners were these enslaved people. And what would be worse than slavery in life would be slavery also in death at the hands of one's own people. And a lot of those African spiritual traditions wanted their souls to go back to Africa. And if your soul was captured, which is essentially what the original zombie was, that journey would not be possible. And I mean, that was horrific enough in itself. So Voodoo believes that there are two parts to the soul, the T-bonage and the gros bonage, and that if you capture one, you are able to control the sort of husk of the body. So the original zombie is not flesh-eating or anything like that. The zombie is sort of mindless, forced laborer that is being manipulated literally at the hands of what is called a bokor, or a malevolent Voodoo practitioner. So that tradition we see a little bit emerge in film, but we also see it start to be demonized in the early 20th century with the American occupation of Haiti. And of course, to try to make those actions look morally and legally appropriate, we start getting a lot of reports from military, but also journalists who were occupying Haiti at the time, of painting Voodoo as being cannibalism and like sacrifices and all these incorrect assumptions. And those get baked into some of the earliest movies that showed the zombie on camera, which I think is really interesting. And then how do we get to the sort of brain-eating headshot type? George Romero is largely to thank for that, and Night of the Living Dead. But what we have to keep in mind too is that when I couldn't find any direct evidence that Romero was familiar with the Voodoo zombie. At least he never really spoke of that or wrote of that in a way that I could find concrete evidence. I do think, of course, that he was aware of the earlier films, and that was definitely informing some of his work. But we also have to keep in mind things like the vampire, the Dragor, these other more violent undead corpses, the ghoul, as he famously called his zombies, are also part of that tradition. But again, that flesh-eating zombie came in a completely different period of time, and I think was meant to serve completely different purposes. Things like response to the violence of the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement and this movement and change in opinion of urban versus rural life, like all these themes, the demise of the nuclear family, those are all present in Night of the Living Dead. And I think one, at least for me, the scene that stood out to me, two scenes that stood out to me as a kid. The first one was when the daughter is eating the corpse of her parent. And I think that's terrifying. A whole nother podcast episode, right? About like why creepy kids are a thing. So that in itself is going on. But most literally, that was what a lot of conservatives feared at the time in America, that youth culture was becoming so dominant and so forceful that it was literally eating the bodies of their parents. So that, I think, would have stood out as horrific for a lot of people. I know as a parent now myself, that concept is terrifying.
Yeah, it hits different.
Right. Definitely it's different as a parent. And I think that's actually an interesting tangent of how horror hits you at different stages of your life. So I think my own personal journey with the zombie, Z-O-M-B-I or Z-O-M-B-I-E, definitely changes over time as well. And I think that my own journey in some ways mirrors probably what a lot of people think about the zombie as a concept.
Oh, so many things to comment on. I was like taking notes while you were sharing. So let's see, where do I want to start here? So backing up a little bit to zombies are linked to the practice of voodoo, and then you've got Vodou, and then you've got hoodoo, sort of this development from the West Indies that as slaves, there's a lot going on here. One of the more horrific real life horror moments, I think, for at least for me, someone in the Christian community, is in 2010, Pat Robertson gets on the air and attributes this horrific earthquake to Haiti. It's because they practice voodoo, sort of buying into perhaps some of these stereotypical media images. And it's largely condemned, but it did highlight the tense relationship between Christians and the practice of voodoo. And it's not just as the capital V religion, but also lowercase voodoo as what people observe as scripts in popular culture. And I think what you highlighted really well is what gets overlooked is the history between these religions in the West Indies, slavery and Christianity and Catholicism. And having been to the Voodoo Museum in New Orleans, I was there presenting at an academic conference and went to look in there just partially for research for this podcast and also just my own teaching in world religions. It was striking to see among the many, there was of course the voodoo dolls and other things you would expect to see, but it was striking to see how many Bibles and Christian iconography and saints were on display. And so just kind of circling back a little bit, can you walk us through a little bit more of that relationship? My understanding from the readings I've done is there's this syncretism where, and this has happened with other religions and groups too, where, all right, we're going to come in and we have this indigenous religion and we're going to maybe relate this saint to this God and try to get people to be good Catholics, good Christians and get away from this. And then what's also interesting is I've read where that doesn't go how Catholics at least want it to go, where you're finding people who practice Vodou or voodoo, which again, it feels like it grows out of New Orleans and is kind of an American, in many ways, an American thing versus over against a little bit differentiated from voodoo. But they are now taking Catholic liturgy and incorporating it into voodoo practices. So basically, hey, thanks guys, this is great ideas. We're going to take this. And so it's this really strange relationship. I don't know, can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. We're saying that Christians probably don't like, it's not just that was like a cool idea. It's that there's a lot of aspects of Christianity in Vodou and Voodoo because those elements had to be there for the survival of those practitioners. So everything was taken from the enslaved Africans, including attempts to forbid or even outlaw their religious practices. So this begins as early as 1685, when King Louis XIV of France actually made it a law that all French slave owners had to baptize their slaves. And failure to do so or to allow them to continue their traditional religious practices didn't only result in consequences for the enslaved individual, but for the slave owner themselves, which is a really interesting way to get people in line. So by adopting elements of Christian practices, by assigning some of those loa to saints to make those sort of crossover points, that allowed enslaved people to gather and practice their traditional religions under the guise of the allowed religion. And of course, over time, this evolves and keeps going and develops its own sort of practice. But I think a lot of the times when you have something like colonialism or slavery that comes into play, when, of course, it doesn't just happen in the West Indies, right? That part of the reason I think we see those Catholic elements present is because that's a form of resistance in itself, right? It's like, I'm going to take this thing that you're trying to force down my throat and integrate it into my own traditions. And when I was interviewing a lot of the, not just voodoo and voodoo priests and priestesses, but people who are Haitian and whose family members were at one point enslaved generations ago, they emphasized to me this idea of resistance, sort of undermining the zombie and voodoo. Again, because it's, in some ways it's all about survival, but you could say that about a lot of religions, right?
Yeah.
I think that having some kind of spiritual practice is a core part of identity, both self and culturally, for a lot of people on this planet. And seeing that overlap isn't that surprising when it comes down to that fact, in my mind. And I also think that I've been to the Voodoo Museum myself, and I do find it very fascinating. I think it is surprising at first when you see this spiritual faith that's been, at least my encounter with voodoo previously had been lowercase v voodoo. So I think that when we see icons that are maybe familiar to us from more traditional Western faiths being in line of something that we've seen in pop culture as being demonized, there, it is very like striking and intriguing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, who's to say that one person's spiritual text can't be used in another person's practice? Like,
Sure. Yeah.
works for me. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I think just from an internal perspective, we have in our tradition, we've got a quote by one of our church founders that floats around that says, force is the last resort of every false religion. And it's interesting where in a kind of a getting into a conservative Christian mind, as someone who's maybe listening to this or reading this, it's interesting that where this forceful attitude, we're going to make you baptize these people, we're going to make you do this, ends up fueling and leading to the creation of an alternate religion that they might not agree with. So it backfires in some ways. And I don't mean that as a pejorative to people who don't practice Christianity. I just mean that it's interesting where we think we're going to really come in here and convert some people by forcing them, and you end up, it goes completely sideways from their perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially because at least I think a lot of the Christian thought that I'm familiar with, especially conservative Christian thought, is this idea of saving people and bringing people into a faith that is very beautiful in a lot of ways. And that does happen, but also these more, as you said, forceful ways do happen, and not everyone takes to it, right? And that's where, we have these sort of offshoots or other traditional practices that come into play and take on literally a life of their own, or in the case of Voodoo, emerge as a result of that force, which is an interesting perspective, I think, for any faith to keep in mind when you're trying to share your belief system. That, I mean, it's cliche, but you usually get more flies with honey than with the stick. Yeah.
One comment that you make, you talk about how this idea of being captured in terms of the zombie, right? You've got, there's physical slavery, and then the idea of having your soul captured and be made to do labor and work. I mean, you dead, let me rest. It's over. And now I have to go up. And so I was thinking about this. There has been some really interesting research done on some what we'd call haunted tours or ghost tours, especially in the southern parts of the US, and how they will retell narratives involving actual slaves that don't really represent history very well. In almost a metaphorical way, they are making the slaves work again in terms of a narrative to basically line the pockets of, in the case I read, and I can put this in the show notes, of white tour owners. And so almost, whether it's intentional or unintentionally, making them work again. And I'm wondering too, your comment from looking at the representations of voodoo, lowercase v, in popular culture, does this create some tension in the sense that they are appropriating and misrepresenting a faith, voodoo, capital V, and making people work again in a way that is that sort of reinscribes slavery? I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of the larger zombie tradition, I don't think that intentional or unintentional really on the back of any creator's mind that they're thinking of that tradition, and maybe should be. But I think absolutely when you have any kind of fictional text or text that's sold to you as nonfiction, like maybe something like a ghost story that, or I think it's even something like The Serpent and the Rainbow, which a lot of people take as like the accurate account of Voodoo when it is not. Particularly the movie is definitely not. So I don't think, at least that I'm aware of, there's ever really been an accurate portrayal of a Haitian zombie alongside Voodoo that by anyone, quite frankly. So I think that when you get into more problematic conversations like the one you're talking about, like, making these people's stories work for white folks. Again, I think that's particularly relevant and problematic when you're directly putting voodoo of any case, right, alongside the zombie. Yeah. And I think that even just moments like this, pointing that out and getting that sort of thought in people's brains as even being something of consideration is super important. And I do recognize myself, and this is something that came up in discussion both internally and externally at PBS, of me being the one to do a documentary on zombies in America as a white woman. And I think that my response to that is trying to amplify as many other voices as possible with the platform that I do have and allowing for people to respond to the conversations. So I would love to see a representation of a Haitian zombie from someone who is deeply ingrained in like the voodoo community. That being said, I don't know if it will ever happen, because one thing I do want to state for all the listeners out there is that zombies, as voodoo and voodoo practitioners understand them, do exist. So when you're talking about something that's so intimate to someone's religion and about bodies that are present, like in our physical world, not in fiction, that gets super complicated to put into any kind of text, pop culture or otherwise. So I don't know, maybe it'll happen one day and I would love to see that. But I'm sure there are many other faiths out there and even individual practitioners of those faiths who are like, oh, I wish my journey was shown accurately. And I think that for voodoo and voodoo practitioners, they would say the same thing, right? Like we're all sort of looking to see ourselves represented in a way.
Yeah, I think we talked about this last season. We looked at Jesuits and werewolves and indigenous beliefs and practices, and bringing up, hopefully it's not a cliched example, but when J.K. Rowling kind of wrote a Harry Potter spinoff for America or the United States, she took the idea of skinwalkers and really wove them in there and had this idea of the Europeans brought these powers and taught the indigenous. And it really was incredibly problematic because there are indigenous groups, First Peoples, Native Americans, this is like an active, real belief for us. This is not just something for popular culture. And so I think that, it's really important to ask some of the hard questions. Like, am I the one to represent this? And am I representing this in a way that is portraying this very active belief graciously? Or am I just trying to make a buck?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what is the intent of that use? And I think that's the very fine line between appropriation and appreciation. And I think we should all be striving for the latter, of course. But again, part of that is being able to respond to criticism.
So one other thing, and sorry to dovetail, there's so many things that you've said that have just given me ideas to talk about. When you're talking about George Romero's film where the kid is eating the parents, right? And does that get into maybe a commentary on moral panic, as far as, because usually moral panic is kind of always sort of, not always, but a lot of times start in youth culture. And what are these kids up to today? And they're going to be the death of all of us. And I'll get into a general question about what zombies symbolize here in a minute, but is that part of the narrative around zombies? Is there's this moral panic, the kids have gotten into something, and
Yeah, I think moral panic is present in a lot of zombie movies, if not all of them. I think, again, with Night of the Living Dead, that's very relevant because we do have that little girl zombie, which is probably one of the first times we've seen that type of character on screen before. So I think it's very in that way. So yeah, I mean, anytime you have a child or a childlike being doing something that's perceived as violent, besides sort of the uncanniness of that, there's definitely going to be the moral panic aspect. And again, with Night of the Living Dead and even Romero's later films with zombies, they always highlighted tensions that were happening at the moment. So Night of the Living Dead, again, commentary on the civil rights movement, that moral panic with that, uprising of youth culture, destruction of the nuclear family, you have the violence of the Vietnam War, and like so many other things going on. And then you get into something like Dawn of the Dead, which touches on some of those same themes, but is also about overconsumption and consumer culture and sort of the groups, I'm thinking of like the gangs that are in that, like that form in response to trauma or even trauma bonding as a thing. And you know, there's something to be said that movies like Dawn of the Dead were remade in the 21st century, and tracking how the zombie has changed in the 21st century, at least in my opinion, I think is really interesting because there's moral panic that's coming still into play, but a lot of the time that moral panic is directly linked to scientific or technological panic as well. But again, you could see that in some of the earlier 19th century Gothic texts as well.
Yeah, and this brings up a really important point and give us like the Spark Notes version. But looking at what the zombie represents, obviously you've got in terms of religious symbolism, what does it represent, but also moving through different eras of zombie media. Again, most people who have not been exposed, who might be listening and think, oh, it's just all gross. But there is a definite critique, a symbolism. So kind of walk us through maybe 3 or 4 or 5, like this is what the zombie is represented and how it's maybe shifted as we get into different seasons and realities as a culture.
Of course. So I would say the original zombie, ZOMBI, coming from the Haitian Voodoo tradition, that is about, again, enslavement. That's about resistance and rebellion. There's some influence of Voodoo in actually the Haitian Revolution there, which is fascinating in a lot of ways. So also the fear of being hurt by your own people, not just outsiders. Those are things all present in the Haitian zombie that are translated in through a racial lens in early 20th century films, where we have some undead bodies or zombies that are shown on screen that are always, at least in the first ones, under the control of a white European. So I think the allegory is pretty obvious there in a lot of ways. And then you have Romero zombie. So yeah, about moral panic, uprising of youth culture, changing civil rights. So we still have race as a thread under all of this, I think is important to point out. Then you have what I would call like the pandemic zombie, which comes in part from some video games in Asia in the late 80s and early 90s, but also as a response to the terrorism attacks at the turn of the 21st century. We see more of this fear of bioterrorism, of scientific advancement. The idea of the mad scientist sort of returns again and again in the zombie. And then I think our most current iteration is the hive zombie, which I could say the best example is the movie version of World War Z, where you don't just have a handful of zombies controlled by this one person or a couple hundred or a couple thousand. You now have literally millions surging in this sort of very animalistic, unthinking, that's why I use hive, a sort of journey. And I think that when you have that many bodies on screen, you have to be thinking about overpopulation and like global identities. And I've seen a lot of trends across all, not to say that there's only one type of zombie that can be made during one period, but those would probably be like the 4 sort of trends I've noticed. I think more recently too, we've seen a lot of these same themes, but then with an environmental aspect. So the contagion that turns people into these violent, unthinking monsters tends to be from either like a response literally from nature of something, a virus developing and accidentally being spread or intentionally being spread as sort of a result of the real trauma that we're doing to the environment. So I think that's sort of a little bit of a new wave of zombie lit that we've seen coming out. And that, I guess, would be like the Spark Notes version. Because
that's really good. And you mentioned the hive zombie World War Z, which was one of the questions I was dying to ask you. So and I read this years ago, and it's one of those, I kept meaning to circle back. I think I have it like right here somewhere, like right behind me even. So I read World War Z, which is not the movie. So if people have never read the book, I remember picking up the book and like, this is not what the trailer was. This is very different. And really for me, it uses the zombies as a metaphor for the spread of a pandemic, of some kind of disease. It really, and in many ways, the zombies are in the book, but they're not like, it doesn't talk about them a lot. They're there, but they're not, it's more like news, if I'm remembering right, like news reports. And I've wanted to revisit that book in light of COVID-19 and wondered if you had any thoughts on what the book suggested and what we actually saw play out during the pandemic.
Yes, absolutely. So to clarify, Paul, you're absolutely correct that World War Z is like I think it's some heading to something like the count of the survivors. So it's a journalist interviewing different people in different professions across the globe who have managed to survive the outbreak, which is what they refer to it as. And I've met Matt Brooks in person. He's wonderful and very smart and using horror in a way that is genius and that I admire in a lot of ways. But let's just say there's a reason why he was put into government projects in the United States government after writing that book is because, he did a lot of research and a lot of thought thinking about how people would respond in these crazy pandemic situations, which of course with COVID-19 became even more relevant. So I think 2 really interesting texts to consider in light of COVID are World War Z, but also the 2011 movie Contagion. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It kind of trended for a little bit because I think it, of course, happened to be streaming during lockdown and people were like, oh my God, this is what really happened. But I think that World War Z, the original written text, and Contagion both show how brutal humanity can be to one another, but also how cooperation can and will happen in an apocalypse and in a pandemic, which of course we saw that. I think both of those texts do a really good job at showing how unprepared a massive portion of the global population is for any kind of unexpected pandemic or even a natural disaster, to be quite frank. I remember reading World War Z for the first time and being struck at how it summarized that the cover up for the virus began immediately, not just denying its existence, but the government trying to like push it onto someone else very quickly. And in the book, despite the first infection happens in China, but popularly it was called the African rabies because there was a larger outbreak in South Africa. And that, looking back now as a scholar of monsters, makes total horrific sense to me because first of all, we did the same thing with COVID, right?
Yep.
We put a racialized derogatory name onto it to try to make it seem scarier to certain people. And I think that's incredibly problematic in a lot of ways. Again, we saw that happen in COVID. And then contagion, which is truly chilling to me before COVID-19 and now is anxiety inducing, at least for me, to be quite frank, because it seems so accurate. That took out the zombie aspect of the conversation that was happening with World War Z and really just looked at a contagion that was proven to have evolved from combined viruses in a pig and a bat. And they got a lot right there, not just with like the science, but how looting and different, they even have basically like a quarantine prom at one point in the movie. They didn't call it that, of course. So it's surreal. But I think that both World War Z and Contagion and the other movies like them that sort of deal with these pandemics or viruses in the science fiction or horror sort of genres, that is not surprising at all that they'd be able to predict things or to speculate about things that then do happen. Again, like I said at the beginning of our conversation, that's been happening since Gothic literature was created. And that's because I think in particular, the undead body and more broadly horror allow for these speculations and sort of hard truths through this veil of a genre that's not serious, when in fact it's the exact opposite. And I actually was part of a psychological study that was part of like a large cohort of different people in the humanities and the sciences that explored how people responded to COVID-19 mentally in correlation to how many like survival movies and horror movies and zombie movies that they watched. And wasn't the only study that did something similar, and it hasn't been, but there is a correlation scientists are finding that people who are exposed or like to prepper texts and horror texts actually have more mental capacity to handle stress of real horrific situations. And I could get all literature professor on you about this.
Please do.
Oh, okay. So I am a capital R romanticist, and there was a famous writer then called Edmund Burke who wrote a text called On Origins of the Sublime and the Beautiful. And to make it super simple, beautiful things were feminine and pretty and soft and inspired, like love and affection and feelings of protection. Sublime things were masculine things that were so shocking and awe-inspiring that all thought would be absent from like your brain. So a lot of romanticists were trying to get that, either feel something sublime or get to a picturesque, which is the happier version of the sublime. But there's this idea that Burke came up with called delight, which is when you are exposed to someone else's sublime experience and then can have your own sort of emotional and intellectual response. That's almost like a test run of that thing. So the example that I like to use for this is if you're standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, like with no guard railing and you're about to fall, that would be a sublime experience. Like your literal life is in danger. Nothing else is going to be sort of in your mind. But delight would be maybe watching a horror movie of that situation or looking at a picture of the Grand Canyon where you can still recognize its beauty and its power, but your own life is not at stake. So I think we see delight play out as this sort of like emotional, intellectual exercise for us in conversations about like, why do people want to watch executions?
Right.
So it's this idea of seeing something horrible happen to someone else will somehow prepare us for a horrible situation. And there's some science out now and before and after the pandemic that there might be something to that, which is really interesting. And I think to speak to an earlier point you made of sort of pop culture texts getting attention, I think that if we view them as this sort of Burkean delight examples of how can we use storytelling and monsters to teach people things, not just to scare people, I think that we can have some really interesting and productive conversations.
Yeah, that resonates a lot. And we can look for even some of those studies. If you know any off the top of the head or just some names, we can find it and put it in the show notes.
Yeah, I can drop it to you, email it to you for sure. Yeah.
It would be great. I know for me, like I have watched clips of like the Bolivian death road. I don't know if you've seen clips of that. Like it's like the most dangerous road in the world. I would never drive on that road. Yeah. But I will sit there in front of YouTube and like I'm driving and just watch it. I'm like, why am I watching this? This is horrific. Yeah. But like when they pan the tires on the edge of like 1,000-foot drop, like we're in the Northwest, so we have mountains we drive, and I'm always white knuckling when I'm out there. So this is not like, I don't enjoy this in real life, but why am I watching it here? And it's almost like that I'm preparing. Yeah, there's a morbid fascination element too, but I do think, my personal opinion, if you can't tell, is that I subscribe to this sort of horror as intellectual and emotional exercise when it's at its best, at least. Yeah. And I think that's important too for a lot of our listeners who may not like the genre, appreciate the genre, or even pop culture in general, is realizing that there are some very specific benefits, tools, and resources that as we're creating art as human beings, it just represents one way that we process what's happening in life. And there's some good substantive things to encounter. Pivoting back a little bit to popular culture, away from literature now, I heard about The Walking Dead out of all places at a pastor's meeting from a speaker whose wife had gotten him into it. And they said this interesting social commentary. And so eventually, like, all right, I'm going to see what this is. I've heard about it. So I watched it, and after a while, and this is just my opinion, so if there's somebody out there, I apologize if you're a fan of this. It felt like an endless loop. They find sanctuary with people, but those people turn out to be bad, and then there's a conflict, and zombies attack, and they escape, and then they find some other people, but they're bad, and then and it felt like and so after a few seasons, with no explanation given for where these zombies are coming from, we just know that people die, then they come back. I kind of got burnt out. Like, I don't feel like we're going anywhere, and I don't know if that's the point. But what is your take on the series and the comic book it's based on, and why do you think it has resonated so much?
I'm so glad we're talking about this. The Walking Dead was one I'm actually published in a peer-reviewed collection about The Walking Dead. So I won't bore you all with that, but I have lots of thoughts. Yeah. So I will admit, for any listeners out there, that I stopped watching the television series at like 4th or 5th season, I think for some of the reasons that you just mentioned. But I also think it began to deviate too far from the original comic. And not, of course, in any kind of adaptation that changes are going to be made. But that wasn't the problem with me. The problem for me is that in the comic series, in my opinion, the violence and brutality always had a reason and might have been horrific, but never felt gratuitous because it directly served like another character's personal journey or growth or development in some capacity. Sure. And in fact, a lot of the stuff that happens in the comic is more horrific than what's shown. And they actually cut out some of the major plot points from the comic series because I think that they were too afraid to translate them to television. Yet I think that the Kirkman series does a lot better job. And I think that comes down to the original comics creator, Robert Kirkman. He said that he approached it, the plot, it was never about zombies, that he wanted to do a character study set in the apocalypse. So the comic series, the zombies were sort of the bad antagonists on the outside to point more attention to the bad antagonists on the inside in humanity. So the comic was never really about the zombies, but about the living. The whole zombie apocalypse in the Walking Dead series stresses how interpersonal relationships both form and are maintained or are stressed, but also about how society develops because we have these different microcosms of the human experience and the different sort of survivor groups and their different spiritual beliefs and moral traditions and sort of what they believe in a lot of ways. And the name The Walking Dead, and this is revealed in the comic, actually refers to the living characters. Not the undead. And I think that's the reason why it resonated so much. And even the television show does resonate so much with people, is that it shows a variety of different ways of how people can survive, some more practical than others and some more brutal than others. But it also shows how community forms even in these horrible times and how things like friendship and family and loyalty can and will continue as part of human nature, even in horrible scenarios. And I think that's what all good zombie texts do. Personally, like all my favorite zombie movies, comics, what have you, shows that the real monsters are still the fully human ones. And I think that's honestly what all really great monsters do, is that it's best horror texts are never about the actual creepy thing. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think a lot of people also, myself included, really like The Walking Dead because some of the goriness is inspired in a lot of ways and I mean, the special effects makeup alone is worth mentioning. And I think that's one thing people also sort of forget about when we hype up too much this idea of trying to demonize something because it shows like blood or gore or rotting flesh. Like we have to recognize the artistry that went to create that fictional representation of that. And as a larger comment on gore in general, and I think this is the reason.
That was my next question too. Perfect. And full disclosure, I don't like gore. I'm not. And so sometimes I'll like scrub past like, okay, back to the plot. I'm not a big fan of it, but I don't mean that in a judgy way. Just not for me. But zombie media in general, not just, I mean, everything from video games to comics is known for its goriness. And certainly whether it's a zombie movie, a historic film, science fiction, we recognize to bring these media properties to life. Even religious dramas too. The makeup and special effects is critical to get us into the story. But one question I'm so excited you're addressing is, are there good reasons to amplify the gore in a zombie? Or is it just simply like, hey, let's just be gross? Like, what's the purpose of this?
First of all, I think we should just make the caveat that, at least how I'm going to talk, I think gore, I would also agree, is absolutely part of the zombie genre
Yeah.
and very separate from the Haitian zombie. Like
Okay.
very different from that. It's not gory at all in the Vodou or voodoo traditions. But in terms, of like the pop culture, Zombie, I definitely think gore is part of it. And yes, I mean, there's a horror subgenre called like splattercore, and people who just really think it's amusing or funny or whatever to see all these like blood and guts on screen. And I'm not part of that sort of fandom, so I don't want to speak to that too much. But for me, I think kind of like with The Walking Dead and the violence, I think that gore is about reminding us that, especially with zombies, they're human bodies at their core. They still have blood and guts. They rot and decay. The flesh may hang from their bodies. And I think that some people don't like to see that and might have a problem with it because it gets into that uncanny valley because it's us. I mean, I think that's the important thing to keep in mind with zombies of all kinds, is that these aren't vampires that are turned for a specific reason and develop like special powers, or they're not something that's made under a curse like a werewolf or forced to transform and take on animalistic characteristics in that regard. It's like these are human bodies, should be dead or mindless enough that they act like they're no longer human. And I think that there's a reality to that. And I think gore shows us that reality in a super visceral way. Death is uncomfortable, but so is the idea of injury. It's also the truth of the human condition and experience. Like we are bodies that are gross. There's a lot of like gross things happening even in our living bodies. So I think that the gore in the zombie genre has not just become a hallmark. I think if you approach it in this way of reminding us that we are human, it can actually be interesting intellectually. And of course, and this became an issue actually in the Walking Dead series, that there were zombie variants. So zombies that developed like unique abilities. And I know Kirkman, the original creator, was like not fully on board with that because it kind of went away from his intention with the zombies. And I thinking too, something like Resident Evil, we have all these mutations, and that's like a subgenre of zombies that I think is really interesting, but doesn't speak to the gore experience, at least the way I'm describing it. Like, but that's different too. Because like in a video game, it's like cool to shoot this like weird postulating thing. Like it's gross, but then like you kill it, then you feel like good about yourself. That's a whole nother journey. Yeah.
No, and I'm glad you brought that up. Like that touches on the work of someone I'm sure no doubt you're familiar with, Julia Kristeva, and her idea of objection, not object with an A, abjection. And I used to talk about this in class where she talks about how you kind of enter this weird liminal space when me as a living, breathing human being encounters a dead body. Like I don't know what to do with that. Like that's not something I should see. That's something that should be buried. That's something that should be somewhere else. And one of the experiences I had for my class, which looked at monsters, faith, and pop culture, and very grateful to the nursing department. And we went through a whole lecture on being respectful and all these different things. But we took them to the cadaver lab and said, for those of you who've never encountered a dead body, I want you to, and then reflect on it. And it's a difficult exercise because like, I think like you said, it reminds us this is us. This is what happens if you live long enough, if you get old enough, the body, and then where are we in all of this? So like, where did we go? Like there's our body, there's our hands, but there's no one, maybe a bad way to say it, but no one's home, right? It's just, there's no mind there anymore. And maybe that's just dovetailing off your comments. When you see that sort of visceral dissection, mauling of the body, it's very uncomfortable, not just because it's gross, but it reminds us that as maybe as powerful as we think we are, sometimes we're very fragile as well. And
I mean, this comes up with other undead monsters too. I'm thinking like of the vampire, that a lot of what's going on there is the perversion of taking something that's supposed to be inside and bringing it outside, right? In like the form of blood. But the same thing could be said for zombies. Even the flesh eating part seems kind of obvious, but even if it's not that, like you're saying, like seeing some of the images of The Walking Dead, even I think the first episode, right, is this like corpse missing part of her face, like crawling to the protagonist and like that and to the viewer. And that's really scary because it's something, like you said, that should be hidden and not moving and in some ways like a secret. And then it's like exposed in a really physical way. And I think that's really frightening. Yeah. I'm interested in the cadavers. My father's a pathologist. So I grew up with conversations about medicine and the human body and cadavers, because part of his job is to do autopsies, and that's also part of medical training. So for me, and I'm reminded of this when I'm around people like my husband or other family friends, and I'm like, oh wait, like this is not like normal dinner table conversation for a lot of people.
Guess what I saw last week?
Literally, yes. So I think that's really interesting. It's like the perspective and how bodies have been presented to you. So if we look, if we want to get again into like the educational side of horror, like which you did, right, with taking your students to go see those cadavers, I think that part of the confrontation that horror and monsters provides us can maybe allow us to take on new perspectives that are then helpful in our own real living lives.
Yeah. It's interesting. Just for my context as a local pastor, I was meeting with a group of some of my elderly church members, and we were just talking about things that we can do, what sort of programs and seminars and outreach, whatever it is. And one of them, she said, can we basically talk about death? Can we have some talks about death and dying? Because for many of us, that's a reality in the very near future. And we don't know how to approach it because it kind of launched this whole stream of conversation in the meeting about, at least in the West, at least where we're at, we medicate, we hide, anything pain, death, growth, we kind of just push that away until we can't. And then we're left with, I don't have the tools to know how to, like a zombie, death is crawling closer. And like, I don't know how to deal with this. And so it was an interesting, just again, reflecting on your comments. Yeah, it's an issue that we all have to sort of grapple with, and we don't do well. We like to hide that reality.
Yeah. And I think broadly, the undead are like forcing that reality into our world.
So there's one more. I forgot in the list of questions I sent you. I forgot to bring this up, but I think it's important. The Last of Us. So your thoughts really quickly on, I mean, there's the game and then there's the HBO series, but that as somebody who does video game research and religion, to see a video slowly, in my opinion, starting with Castlevania as being the first critically acclaimed as well as commercially. And that's important to say, critically acclaimed adaptation. And then moving to like The Last of Us, we're starting to finally, after many, commercially successful, but critically failed attempts to get video games into film. What are your thoughts on The Last of Us?
I will also say that I'm familiar with The Last of Us from the video game. I didn't play it myself, but I watched my brother play it, and I'd read all the gaming magazines. I was like very well versed in the world. And what stood out to me in the video game that they translated, I think, well onto screen is that was an idea that I hadn't heard of, right? Of like fungus causing the undead. Like the genius of that was light bulb moment. And I think that one of the reasons the show is able to be so critically successful is because they have the original creators of the video game, like at the writer's table. And there's actually, it's honestly spectacular. Shot for shot, you can do comparisons of the video game to the television series, like in terms of clothing, lighting, like dialogue. And as a fan of both, that's super exciting to see. But I think more broadly, it speaks to the level of visual care and storytelling that is present in the Last of Us series. That, again, the Last of Us video game has like a lot of the weird clickers and like cool mutations that are made possible because they have this more fungus-based type of undead creature. And there's like, a creativity that I really admire. But it's about that human tension and the tension between humans and between like two people who weren't supposed to be put together but are. And this idea, not to be too spoilerly, of like a savior, of like, is this one person going to actually then help the world and like a savior in the Christian tradition or other Judeo-religion traditions? And I think that's fascinating, something that maybe feels a little familiar to people, that helps it maybe get some of that critical recognition. Yeah, but that's just my opinion. I'm a big fan. I'm really curious to know how they're going to move forward, because they're going like video game to video game. And there's some, it seems almost like it's going to be, spoiler, Harry Potter like esque, in that as the character ages up, like things get even more intense. And I think that's an important part also of like humanity to show, and to see Ellie grow up in these horrific conditions. And reminds me again a lot of children in our real world who grow up in horrific conditions. And it's a thought-provoking series. And so I think that's one of the things that makes it critically successful.
Yeah, 100%. One of my colleagues last year, who I met while I was there, she's a Hebrew scholar, I think, in the UK. And she did a paper presentation at American Academy of Religion looking at the soteriology, or what we'd call the salvation theology of Last of Us. And it's a very sharp critique of some models of what we'd call the atonement. For those who are listening, that's how God reconciles humanity to himself. But it's a sharp, very specific critique of traditional Christian atonement theology. And so when you see it, you can't unsee it. You're like, nope, that's very clearly there. And so again, just kind of underscoring these pop culture texts are not, they're for entertainment and everyone uses them differently, but there's some pretty profound thought and reflection in them. And it's fascinating to watch these things morph and change. Probably an impossible question to ask you, as we're slowly getting towards the end here. Best zombie movie of all time. Just a hot take, just to make everybody mad. Who's listening?
I can't do top one for me would probably be Night of the Living Dead. Not only because that was one of the first I was exposed to, but again, I think it really was so foundational for how we see zombies in popular culture today. That was different from the Haitian tradition. But I also, hot takes more recently, I think, another two that stood out to me a lot would be 28 Days Later, and then Train to Busan. And I am livid that they're allegedly making like an Americanized remake of Train to Busan, which is a South Korean film. Absolutely fantastic. So yeah, those would probably be my top three would be Night of the Living Dead, 28 Days Later, and Train to Busan.
And then pivoting to your personal work now, Monstrum, I hope I got this right. It's in its 6th season, right?
It is.
Yeah. And so for students of media and communication, which is what I taught, as well as religion and public scholars on any discipline, anyone who's sort of saying, how can I get my research, my interests out of like, this is a bad metaphor, it's cliche, but the ivory tower, right? How do I get it out there and really talk to people? What are some key highlights of your journey in terms of developing your voice and your platform? And what advice would you give for those looking to create a sort of public platform, whether a scholar or anyone really?
Before I get into probably like my top 3 tips, in terms of my own personal journey, I, full transparency, almost left the PhD program after my first like dissertation proposal defense because it was, and I was told this by my committee members, that like it didn't feel like I was doing good enough. And I realized that was because I was trying to give them what I thought they wanted to see. I was trying to do this like very theory based and like heavy handed and like very, lack of better way of putting it, like old school academic, like ivory tower traditional way of approaching my subject, the undead. And it wasn't working and my passion wasn't in it. And you could see that in the how I was writing. And so I doubled down on like, if you don't like it, too bad, which has pretty much been my entire career at this point, is really, if you're truly passionate about the subject, I think that's going to come through in how your communication. And so as important as it is to have collaborators and to listen to people you admire and mentors, I think being really true to yourself. I got a lot of responses from people in my own field who were tenured track individuals or editors of journals and like well-established scholars who the question is like, well, what are you going to do with that? Like, why are you studying the undead? I actually had someone who will not be named tell me to choose something different because I would never have a career, which is obviously very ironic given where I am today. So I just had to be stubborn and true to myself. And more than that, like I had to expand my research. So I had to maybe pull in texts or be open to things like studying science and religion and politics and things that I didn't necessarily think I was going to encounter to sort of bring more people into the conversation. So in terms of like tips for public scholarship, obviously we don't do it for the money. You do it because you really do love it. And I think you have to be coming from a good place. For me, part of that is being as diverse and as well researched as I can. So I don't just pull from one type of source. I'm constantly looking for new information from across the globe and not being afraid to ask for help. Reaching out to experts to get their 2 cents on a topic is really helpful. I think that in terms of communicating in the best way, you have to find the elevator pitch for your research that is not just for your tiny little subset of fellow cohort Gothic romanticists will totally understand what I'm saying. Like some random 40 something that I run into in an elevator, I have to be able to explain in 2 sentences why studying monsters matters. So I think coming up with like your 2-sentence thesis statement isn't super academic. And having that be your thorough line throughout everything is important. And then along the same vein, I guess, is not being so protective and precocious of your own work. As I mentioned collaborators earlier, something that's been really helpful translating in my public scholarship work and then more traditional academic work is I'm definitely more open to feedback. I'm sure we all know about like Reader B, right? And I think that I've gotten reviews on things that would have like made me break down in tears previously, but now I'm just like head tilt, like, okay, some points made, some things I disagree with. And I think being open to allowing other people to look at your work and give feedback is critical. And I don't think that a lot of programs and universities out there are, and again, a lot of my feedback doesn't just come from people who have degrees in these subjects or experts, but from people who don't. And I think that's super important is you can't just be catering to other PhDs or MAs or even just other students. You really have to be thinking about people who just want to learn and you trying to provide them with a good way to do that that's accessible. That's
cool. So just a quick study tip, because you have a tremendous amount of output and responsibility. And you mentioned you're a mom and always, that's a lot of time. How do you, maybe 1 or 2 quick tips, how do you study? What's a tip or trick or two on how you get your information without like holding up in a closet for hours?
Which is basically what I did with my dissertation. I think I don't want to like sugarcoat this or glamorize it in any way. Yeah. People out there listening, like I work non-traditional hours. I'm often working 6 days a week or more. So I just try to fit in the time where I can, which especially right now with my son is when he's napping. So like I might only have like 3 hours to do stuff during the week. And I have to really utilize my time and not get distracted, which is easier said than done. And I think too is at least we're trained, or I was trained as sort of a PhD, that I'm supposed to be the end all be all of like this one subset of something. And I think recognizing that you are not going to know everything is a really important tip. Like because you could go down rabbit holes. And that's part of what I love about research is going down those weird rabbit holes, but continuously doing that is going to divorce you so much from your original intention and quite frankly, make you withdraw in other aspects of your life that for me, it's not worth it. So recognizing that you can't know everything and being willing to admit when you don't. Again, being willing to ask for help. I know even in my teaching practice, a student asks me something and I don't know the answer. I will say, I don't know, ask me next class and I'll have an answer. And then I will take the time to do the research to give it back. So if you're going to make that kind of promise, do it. So time management, however that looks for you. I have a dear friend who's getting a PhD in science and she does her best work writing from like the hours of midnight to 5 a.m. And like, if that's what works for you, like do it. But also remembering that you're human and that I think that being a good researcher, a good student, a good teacher, and a good person is not compartmentalizing your life into just your research and your academia. So have passions outside of that and take breaks when you need it.
That's good. So in conclusion, just to wrap up, any upcoming projects that we can highlight, recommend to listeners? And if people really want to connect with you and your work, what's the best way to do that?
So in addition to season 6 of Monstrum, which you can find on pbs.org, the PBS Passport app, and on YouTube, that's the best place to get the most recent. You can also find me at Monstrum PBS on Instagram and also as Dr. Emily Zarka on Instagram. And then I have a website with my name as well, a project that is actually coming out later this summer, currently slated for July. I have a lecture series coming out on Audible about the trope of the serial killer as a monster throughout history, which I'm really excited about. Definitely. I got to do some new stuff, did some overlapping stuff. So again, it's a little bit about like real life serial killers, but it's more about how the public responded to how we have over time responded to making these people into monsters and how that in turn like informs actual real world consequences. So that's coming up. And then, I'm going to be at a couple cons this year as well. So just check me out on my website or my Instagram and feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Emily.
Thank you.
As I discussed the figure of the zombie with Dr. Zarka, I was reminded of the biblical idea of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a day present from creation, but took on a special meaning for those being freed from Egyptian slavery. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 calls people to cease from their labor on the seventh day and those under their power from their labor. It is a day of rest and worship, a reminder that while our work is important, the world doesn't hinge on our production, that our identity and value isn't ultimately tied to what we produce. What's more, the idea of the Sabbath is present in Leviticus 25 as it relates to giving the land a rest every 7 years. The chapter continues on to talk about how every 50 years all mortgaged or leased land was to be returned to their owners and all slaves and bond laborers were to be set free. It's this striking picture of built-in systems that help ensure people aren't reduced to soulless commodities, zombies. While zombie media may not be something we enjoy or promote, personally I'm not a fan of gory content, it is important to recognize that part of the horror of zombie media is being confronted with striking images that speak to humanity's ongoing ability to dehumanize and exploit one another, including caricaturing other religious groups that we have disagreements with. The gross details in zombie media also presents us with reminders of our own mortality, fragility, and materialness. And in light of that, how do we want to care for ourselves and each other? Finally, the Bible uses the imagery of bones, the dead, and tombstones to make critiques of society. That isn't code for arguing that somehow zombie movies are inherently, secretly Christian, but it is to point out that not everything spiritual has to be in pastels and flowery language. Sometimes the macabre is what is needed to make the point when people refuse to listen to prettier pictures. In our next episode, we stay on the theme of the undead by exploring a mysterious character within Adventist Christian history, often used as a cautionary tale for those who get a little too close to subjects about the cadaverous. I hope you'll join us. Thank you for listening.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.